Israel Keyes was one of the most organised and methodical serial killers of all time. He would put together murder kits consisting of what you would expect. That's weapons, gloves, masks, and he would hide them in public spaces just in case he ever found himself in that area again and felt like adding to his victim toll. On top of the murder kits, he also had a very specific set of rules that he followed to a T in order to not get caught. His first rule was to make sure that his crimes had no pattern to them whatsoever, so police had as little to track and predict as possible. It was this rule that meant he avoided detection as an active serial killer for over 15 years. Police had no idea there was even a serial killer out there to catch. But it was the one and only time he broke this golden rule that led to his downfall. Today, we're going to be talking about the murder kit killer, Israel Keyes. Before we get into the case, I want to thank Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. Regular EleanorNeale channel viewers will already know what Magellan TV is. It is my favourite documentary streaming service. I recently watched a documentary on there called Murder on Millionaire's Mile. Immediately that piqued my interest. And this documentary was about a woman named Susan Cohen, who was the wife of a very wealthy property developer. And one day, Susan was found dead in their home, murdered, found by the housekeeper, and her husband was found with blood all over him. Yet he says he didn't kill her. He claims that he walked into that room and found an intruder attacking his wife, and so he had started to fight off the attacker, but they'd already killed his wife, Susan. Rather a convenient story, if you ask me. I guess you'll have to watch the documentary yourself and see all of the evidence and come to your own conclusion. Magellan add between 15 and 20 hours of new content to their website every single week, so you're never gonna get bored. There's always something new to watch. So if you're seriously into true crime, or just documentaries in general, they have so many different genres on there, and they're all great. If you're a documentary fan, you should definitely take advantage of the special offer that Magellan TV are giving you guys, my viewers. If you want to click the link down below in the description and go check it out, please do. I love you, Magellan TV. Thank you again for sponsoring. Quickly, before we get into the case, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. There are quite a few content warnings before we get into this case. It's quite a heavy one, and there's a lot that happens, as I'm sure you can tell from the length of time that this video is. So if any of the following topics are things that you don't want to hear about right now, I completely understand. There's no shame in clicking out of this video. Go look after yourself. But those topics are as follows: animal abuse, sexual abuse, including that of minors, anti-Semitism, suicide and suicide attempts, and self-harm. So like I say, if any of that is something that you don't want to hear about right now, completely understand. And hopefully I'll get to see you again some other time with a different video. But with all that being said, let's get into the case of Israel Keyes. So today's case takes place in America, all over America, so many different states, but it starts out in Richmond, Utah in the 1970s. That's where a couple named John and Heidi Keyes decided to start their family. They met, they married, they were both devout Mormons. In fact, I think most of Utah is Mormon. I think it's a generally quite Mormon state. So a lot of people there are born into the religion, and then like later in life, as they develop and become their own person with their own beliefs and views, they kind of stray away from Mormonism. And the Keyes family were one of those families. Both of the parents were brought up strict Mormon, and as they met each other and as they, you know, grew up, they decided this wasn't quite their thing. So in 1983, John and Heidi Keyes decided to leave the church and also leave their life in Richmond, Utah, and instead they moved to Colville, Washington. I don't know if you pronounce the L in that. Colville? They moved to Washington anyway. The area where they lived, Colville, it was very isolated. It was very out of the way of a lot of things. It wasn't like a neighborhood. It wasn't like a town or a village. They were in the sticks. They were in the middle of absolute nowhere. I mean, it was a beautiful place. It was a very peaceful place. A lot of woodlands, a lot of forests, a lot of nature. It was actually a really, really nice place, albeit very off the grid But I mean, that's what the Keyes family wanted. They bought a plot of land to move on. Not a house. They didn't buy a property. They didn't buy, a building. They bought a plot of land and they took a tent. And they did plan on building their own house, but I mean, that was going to take a while. For a long ass time, this family was living out of a tent. And there were a lot of them, mind. I think at this point in time, John and Heidi had only had like a few kids, but they were gonna have 10 children, 10 siblings, all living either in a tent, and then when the house was finally built, it was only a 1-bedroom house. So that's 10 kids living with their parents in one room. But anyway, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's talk about the process of them building this cabin. It wasn't a house, it was a cabin in the middle of nowhere. The dad, John, was quite a good carpenter. Is that a carpenter? Quite a good builder. He was quite handy. He was a handy man. And so he taught his sons to kind of build with him, I guess. They joined in. They were learning a lot of practical skills. They were learning a lot of survival skills as well, just living out of this tent. They were hunting food. They were foraging. They were really putting their Bear Grylls skills to the test. They had no electricity, no running water, and that didn't even change when they built the cabin. Of course, they had no electricity or running water in a tent, but they didn't even put it in there when they built the house. So this was just their way of life from now on. And yeah, they didn't have any heating, so they would just go out and chop up logs and spare wood and bring it back and make a fire. They would cook their food on this fire, food that they had hunted themselves. They would go out and hunt animals. It was a very unconventional life that the Keyes family lived. And like I said, there were like 10 of them in the end. 10 kids, 5 boys, 5 girls, and then mum and dad. So that's 12 people, all in a 1-bedroom cabin, living off of the land, in the middle of nowhere. It was very isolated. These kids didn't go to school either. None of their births were registered. Like, this was complete off-the-grid living. And they very rarely socialised with other kids, obviously. Like, when are they gonna get a chance to? They don't go to school. They don't really play out with anyone other than their siblings. Which, I mean, there were plenty of other kids there for them to interact with, so I suppose it wouldn't have affected their social skills all that much. Maybe it would have affected their social skills, with talking to authority or older people or something, but I don't know. I think having 9 other young people to grow up alongside would be okay. But it's all the other aspects of their off-grid living that really interest me and also kind of scare me. Like I said, none of the kids were like born in a hospital. Did I tell you that? They were all home births with no medical intervention whatsoever. Those kids never went to see a doctor, so they never got any of their vaccinations, any of their checks. No, like, they could have like serious diseases and no one would know because they've never had a doctor's appointment in their life, which is abuse, is neglect, is very sad. It's honestly a miracle there were never any like major issues, that all of these home births were actually pretty fine, because no medical intervention, no electricity, no running water, literally you're just giving birth with you and the elements in the middle of nowhere, and somehow all 10 of these children were pretty fine. So as you can imagine, the Keyes family were very different to every other family ever. The kids were not like other kids. They weren't like other people, period. Their only substantial social interactions outside of their own family and their own siblings was once a week when their parents would take them to church. At first it was a Mormon church, when they lived back in Utah. But ever since they'd moved to Washington, they had become part of a new church. And I use the word church very loosely because to me this is more like a cult than any kind of religion. So the church was called the Ark, and it, like I say, it was more like a cult that preached Christian identity beliefs. If you're unfamiliar with Christian identity beliefs, then consider yourself lucky, but I mean, I'm gonna tell you and make you sad anyway. It's really shit. It's an incredibly racist, anti-Semitic, and white supremacist interpretation of Christianity. And I say interpretation because it's not like an official branch of Christianity. I don't want you to get the two mixed at any point. This is not like endorsed by Christianity as a whole. But it's just these certain people that have taken Christian teachings and twisted them and made them into something that they're not. They believe that all white people descended from Jesus, and anyone else who wasn't fully white and hadn't descended from Jesus was not as pure. But it gets even worse than that. They believe that the people that are deemed not as pure will either be killed or they will be enslaved by the white people. And again, just want to clarify that this is not an official Christian denomination. They don't endorse this. It's not linked. It's just a small minority of very twisted people that feed into this. I mean, you see it a lot in prisons, actually. There's often Christian identity kind of gangs in prison, and you see it in very isolated areas like this one. So anyway, the Keyes family start going to this church. They start attending services with the Ark, and they're indoctrinating their children with these horrific beliefs from very, very young. That was like these kids' first introduction to the world at large, which is so scary. Imagine being 4 years old and having all of these older people telling you all of this kind of stuff. Like, these kids are gonna grow up to be so messed up. And I think that's kind of all the context you need of the Keyes family, because now we're gonna zone in on one of those kids in particular. The oldest boy, the second oldest overall, Israel Keyes. Israel seemed to enjoy his life and his childhood. He, obviously being the second oldest of all the kids, he had lived for a little while in Richmond, Utah when the family were Mormon, so he'd seen that for a couple of years at the start of his life, and then he had been with them the whole time that they decided to uproot their life and move into this tent and build the cabin. Like, Israel was there for all of that. And he seemed to really enjoy it, like I say. He especially enjoyed learning all of the survival skills from his father. He especially enjoyed hunting his food. And you can see where this is going, right? He enjoyed it way more than what would be deemed normal. It was more than just like a sport for him. It was more than just hunting for food. Like, he enjoyed hurting animals, seeing them in pain. He really, like, got something out of that. In his own words, he said he enjoyed killing anything with a heartbeat, which is gross. I have one pretty graphic example here, which, you know, if you don't want to hear about him killing an animal, then skip forward a little bit. I'll get Editor Jack to put your timestamp on screen. But this example is from when he was still really quite young. I can't believe that he acted this way at such a young age. I don't know exactly how old, but he was young. But I think it's a really interesting early indicator of Israel's clear lack of empathy. Like, even as a child, he was missing such an important part of his personality, and that's empathy. So, one time, Israel was out hunting for food with his father, and he shot a deer. And this deer kind of fell to the floor, but it clearly wasn't dead. And what hunters would do in this instance, they would go over to the animal that is dying and they would put it out of its misery. They would shoot it once again in the head, you know, just to kill it and put it out of the pain that it is currently in. But Israel didn't do that. As I said earlier, Israel enjoyed seeing things in pain. He enjoyed inflicting pain. He enjoyed the fear in his victim. And so instead of putting this deer out of its misery, he proceeded to skin it alive. And you can only imagine the kind of noises that this poor deer was making. And this kid, this child, just continued because he was enjoying it. He skinned a whole deer. I can't, like, and for those of you that are really into true crime, this will be ringing a lot of alarm bells in your head, because killing animals as a child is like one of the biggest early indicators of psychopathy in humans. That's like red flag number one that your child is going to grow up to be a murderer or a serial killer, is if they want to inflict pain on animals and kill animals as a child. They are clearly lacking that major part of their brain that is like, no, don't harm another person. They are lacking empathy to a dangerous degree. Already at 5, 6, 7 years old, that's so scary. I'll spare the rest of the examples and the details, but just know that there are a few different stories of Israel Keyes killing different animals for pleasure, not just hunting, not just, you know, getting food for the family. He was sadistic with it, but like I say, I'll spare you the details. I think that one is enough for you to understand him. There was just such a clear difference between Israel killing animals and his dad and siblings killing animals specifically for food to eat. You know, to survive, to sustain themselves, whereas Israel was getting something more out of it. And what I find quite interesting about all of this is that obviously no one ever told Israel that this was wrong, that this was a bad thing to do. His parents just kind of let him hunt because they needed food, and maybe they just never noticed that he was being weird with it and like something wasn't right there. I don't know, no one ever told him that this wasn't normal behavior to like skin an animal alive. So he was quite proud of it. Like, obviously he enjoyed doing it a lot, so he would want to tell other people about these things that he'd been getting up to. So he would go into the church every weekend, you know, the ark, the church, and he would tell the other kids there what he'd been up to. And of course, they would be horrified to hear this because, you know, not normal everyday families don't even kill their own food, never mind skin it alive. Quickly, people at church started to dislike Israel. They thought he was weird. They thought there was just something weird about him, which says a lot because think about the fucking people at this church. These are already the most twisted, weird fuckers ever. And for them to think you're weird, that says a lot. By the age of about 14, Israel had learned to keep certain parts of himself secret, you know, certain hobbies and interests of his. He learned that the outside world doesn't like those things, and so instead of stopping doing them, he would just do them in secret now. As he grew up, Israel was always getting in trouble with the law. He would break into neighbours' houses. Neighbours, I mean, they lived in the middle of nowhere, but he would walk to the nearest, like, farmhouse and break in and try and steal guns and stuff. It wasn't like he was breaking in to steal, to like, rob the place properly. He was only interested in stealing what he was interested in. So their guns or like knives that he could hunt with. He wasn't going there for like money or valuables that he could sell on. Like, he didn't actually care to rob the house. He just wanted certain bits. He would keep a lot of the guns for himself, but actually he got caught one time trying to sell a gun that he had stolen from one neighbour to another neighbour. Imagine. And once he had these guns, he would go out and just start shooting at things. Like, shooting at people's houses, shooting at people's property, shooting, I don't know, like, you're gonna get in trouble for doing that. And he did. He obviously did. When his parents found out about this, because I don't think it was the police, when his parents found out about this, they took his guns off him, and they made him march down to the neighbours' houses and apologise for breaking in and stealing their guns and shooting their houses with their own guns, but he came and apologised, so it's fine. This didn't really teach Israel anything. He continued to behave like this all his life, but if anything, the only thing it taught him was to be more secretive with it. The only thing this punishment taught him was to get better at committing crimes, and he did. When Israel was 17 years old, his family decided that they'd had enough of their life in Washington. They'd had enough of the Ark Church, and so now they decided to up and move again, this time from Washington all the way to Maine. And this time they lived in an Amish community. So a somewhat similar life, but again, quite a big change, I guess. And just because they left the Ark Church doesn't mean that they left those beliefs behind. They still brought their Christian identity beliefs to the Amish community in Maine. And they were very strict with their beliefs. They were very strict in just like a normal Christian way too, but they were just evil at the same time. John and Heidi Keyes really tried to shelter their children from the outside world as much as they could. They didn't want anything to influence their kids that wasn't them or their church, their beliefs, their religion. So the kids weren't allowed to watch TV. They didn't have a TV in their house. They weren't allowed to play games. They weren't allowed anything unless it was approved by their parents. A couple of the luckier siblings, the older kids, had made friends in their new school because now they were allowed to go to school. Amish school, but they were allowed to go to school. A couple of the older kids had made friends, and so they would often sneak off to their friend's house to go and watch TV shows or play games with them in their normal families in their normal households. At this point in time, Israel is an adult, really. He's like 17, 18, and he is realizing very quickly that he is not on the same page as his parents. He doesn't believe the same things that they believe. He doesn't want to go to church. In fact, he doesn't believe in anything. He decides that he is an atheist. He decided to tell his parents about this, about his change in beliefs, and this went down exactly how you would imagine. They freaked out. They freaked the hell out. They were absolutely horrified. They disowned him. They forced him to move out. They kicked him out of the house. They even ordered all of his other siblings to never contact him again. Like, they really cut him off. His father was more strict than his mother about it. His father never spoke to him again. From the day that he left that house, he was blasphemous. He was a traitor to him. He was dead to him. Israel's father never spoke to him again. His mother would get in contact with him on occasion, but she still wasn't happy with him. She was still disgusted in him, but at the end of the day, it was her son. So she would keep contact with him once in a blue moon. But now, Israel Keyes has been kicked out of his family home, and he is out in the world. So with his newfound freedom, Israel started to just explore life, explore what life had to offer, because his upbringing had been so sheltered. He couldn't read any books or watch TV shows. He didn't really know what was out there in the world. So he spent his first few months just learning things. He was suddenly exposed to all this new information and all these new discussions and debates, and actually Israel ended up changing his beliefs once again. He changed from a Mormon to then the Ark, and then whatever that was. And then he was an atheist. And now he's decided that Satanism is much more his thing. And he became unhealthily obsessed with Satanism. He would read up on it all the time, and it got to the point where he was fantasizing about committing his own ritualistic sacrifice. He was about 19 or 20 years old at this point, and actually when he'd moved out of his parents' house, or been kicked out of his parents' house in Maine, he had moved all the way to Oregon, which is on the complete other side of the United States. It's actually a neighboring state of Washington, which is where he grew up, where they built that one-room cabin. So maybe this was him like going back to his roots, getting back home, or maybe just getting as far away from his family as he possibly could. But he'd moved to Oregon, and he spent a little while getting kind of familiar with his surroundings, learning different locations, and he very quickly found the ideal place for him to commit his ritualistic sacrifice. The Deschutes River, could be saying that wrong, Deschutes River in central Oregon was very popular with teenagers going tubing. Now, tubing was something very new to me in my research. I'd never heard of this before, but it's basically rubber dinghy rapids. You basically get in like your little inflatable donut, and you go down the waves of the river. It's just like a lazy river kind of vibe, I think. I don't know. You can do tubing on snow as well, and on the water. I don't know. Is this like a common thing? I had never heard of it. But anyway, the Deschutes River was very popular for tubers. But there was a particular reason he liked the Deschutes River, and that was because he'd spotted a public restroom, like, along the side of the river that was barely ever used. People are barely ever just standing about on the side of this river. You're either in it or you're not. So no one ever really used these bathrooms, and he noticed that, and he thought this could be the perfect place to kill someone, sacrifice them, and then just leave their body there, and they probably wouldn't be found for quite some time. Well, actually, he'd done a little bit more research into this, because that was his initial plan, but then he realised that these public restrooms used a septic tank, which is just like a big tank of waste underneath that gets, like, emptied. It didn't flow into, like, a sewer or anything. So he thought that he could bury a body in the septic tank, and then septic tanks only get like emptied and I was gonna say refilled. Why would you refill one? They only get emptied every now and again, and especially because this toilet was barely used, it would only get emptied like maybe like twice a year. So he was thinking this was kind of the perfect spot, and plus because it's popular with teenagers going tubing, it might be quite easy for him to find a victim there. So on one summer day, Israel Keyes goes down to the river, and he set himself up on the riverbank just watching, just scoping the area, as he used to do when he was hunting animals. As he was sat there, he was watching people going by in their little boats or in their dinghies, and then he spotted a group of teenagers. And there was one other girl that was kind of lingering behind them. She was a little bit slower than the rest, and she wasn't really joining in the conversation with the rest. She was lagging behind. It was a young girl in her mid-teens. Israel immediately identified that she was younger, weaker, probably couldn't put up a fight. And so as her friends floated out of sight down the river, Israel took his opportunity. He jumped into that river and started wading over to this girl who was now all alone. He grabbed her rubber ring and then started wading her back out, dragging her out of the water and to the public restroom. It was there where he produced a knife and started threatening this girl with it. And of course, she was doing everything that he asked of her because he had a knife to her neck. He told her to undress and then he proceeded to rape her at knife point. Israel later admitted that this wasn't the first time that he had had sex with someone against their will. He admitted that this wasn't the first time he'd raped someone, but that's really scary because there are no previous reports whatsoever, so we don't know how many times he had done this, we don't know who his victims were, and so we don't know if those victims are okay, we don't know if they're alive, like, we don't know anything about any of his attacks before this point. But he says that there were some, and that's all we know. But this time was different, because this was the first time he had planned to kill his victim afterwards. Remember, this was going to be his first ritualistic, satanic sacrifice. And throughout the attack, this poor girl is trying absolutely everything she can to appeal to Israel's softer side. She was begging and pleading for her life and for her safety. She was saying things to Israel like, you know, you didn't have to do this. If you would have just asked me, I would have dated you. Like, we could have done this nicely. And actually, by doing this, by trying to appeal to his deep down emotional side, it actually worked. This young girl didn't know what Israel had planned for her. She didn't know that he planned to make her a satanic sacrifice. She didn't know that the murder was planned out before he even spotted her. But because she begged and pleaded for her life, and because she didn't resist him and she didn't fight him, he eventually let her go, alive. She survived this. When he decided that he was going to spare her life, Israel put the girl back in her rubber dinghy and just pushed her back out into the river. And she eventually found her friends again, and she survived. Although it was a horrific and traumatizing ordeal, that girl escaped with her life. Later on in his life, Israel Keyes looked back on this incident and he told the police that she was pretty smart. It worked. Things never really got violent like they could have if she'd have been fighting me. Because she stayed calm and appealed to his emotional side, that worked. And that's not to say it will work with any other attacker like that. This is just a very unique situation, and that girl was very, very lucky because barely anyone else that crossed Israel Keyes' path made it out alive. Unfortunately, this young girl never reported this incident to the police. I think the only reason we know about this is because Israel Keyes wanted to brag about it at some point later on in his life, but because that girl never reported it, police didn't know that they had such a dangerous man in the area. And so Israel got away with another attack. I mean, to us, this is his first one, but he says there were some before this. We just don't know about them. So it wasn't his first, and it's not anywhere near his last. But one thing that I find really interesting, quite fascinating about Israel Keyes is how much of a normal life he managed to have on the flip side of all of this. All of this dark, disturbing behavior had a very normal side. He had a girlfriend, and with that girlfriend, he later had a baby. They had a daughter together, and this daughter grew to about 10, 11, 12 before all of this eventually came out. So for 12 years, this girl was being raised by a serial killer and no one had any idea. And he was such a normal dad, such a normal boyfriend, like just such a normal guy outside of all of this. Really, it's so weird. I mean, I don't know how much his girlfriend knew about his satanic beliefs and stuff, but I don't know, satanic beliefs doesn't necessarily mean murderer, serial killer, serial rapist, I don't know. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead a little bit again with the daughter. I just find that so interesting. That's one of the most fascinating things about so many serial killer cases to me, is that they have a family. They have children. They have a wife that they go back to at the end of the night and that they kiss on the cheek in bed before they fall asleep after they have just murdered someone. That to me is always some of the craziest elements of true crime cases, how people can have such double lives. But anyway, sorry, going back, let's erase my tangent about the daughter for a second. At this point, the daughter's not here yet. It's just him and the girlfriend. And he works a couple of construction jobs. He's been like picking up different handyman jobs and building jobs, which served him well enough. I mean, the money wasn't good. They were struggling financially, but that's his life. Eventually, Israel decided that he wanted to join the army. So he did. He left his girlfriend at home while he went away for 3 years. For most of that, he was stationed just in different parts of the US, but for 6 months, he was stationed in Egypt. There's not much to note, really, from his time in the military, apart from the fact that he actually seemed to kind of sort himself out. So maybe there is something interesting to talk about from his time in the army. He was quite well behaved, and I don't know if that's because, you know, in the military, in the army, you kind of always observed. You're either always with your colleagues or there's always like a supervisor around, like you literally live amongst your colleagues. So when would he have time to be doing weird shit? The only crime that he committed while he was in the army was one singular DUI, which, I mean, is bad. Don't get me wrong. Don't drink and drive. It's one of the worst things you could ever do. But when I heard that he got caught for one crime while he was in the army, I was expecting it to be some sort of like violent crime, you know, like he raped someone or he had a fight or, you know, something like that. I didn't expect it to be just drinking and driving, because it's almost as if his violent urges kind of stopped when he went in the army. Like, he's still a shit person, don't get me wrong, drinking and driving, but the violence seems to fizzle out. Other than that, yeah, like I said, there's not much to note about his time in the army, apart from that he like really enjoyed it. He really thrived in the army, actually, because when you think about it, it's quite similar to how he was brought up by his parents. Survival skills, sleeping in a tent. I mean, do you sleep in a tent in the army? I don't know. But he had to like hunt his own food and do all his own everything growing up. So he was kind of in his element. His parents also had like military-ish rules. I mean, they were very strict with everything they did. No TV, no games, no nothing. So this was just like home. He drank a lot of alcohol when he was away in the army, but I mean, that was quite a standard thing, I guess. He drank a lot. I don't think he ever developed like a problem though. I really tried to look into that. I think it was just kind of while he was in the army that he was a big drinker, as they all were. And they all used to get into some shenanigans, like some serious shenanigans. And Israel Keyes was the worst for it. Like, they would all do like quite crazy shit when they were drunk, but there were some things that Israel would suggest or that he would do that even made all the other ones look at him like, what the fuck is wrong with him? Like, there was one time where he drank a whole bottle of bourbon and then told all his mates to brand him with hot irons. And they were like, I don't think we should do that, Israel. One last random little fact about his life in the army, and this really is random. Like, I don't usually include things like this in my videos, but I don't know why I found this so interesting. He was a big fan of Insane Clown Posse, and he used to have posters of them up in his army barracks. And that was like the only thing that he had like posters of. It wasn't like he was a poster kind of guy and just put his interests on his wall. Like, he just really liked Insane Clown Posse. So just some interesting serial killer trivia for you. In 2001, at the age of 23, Israel Keyes was honorably discharged from the army and he settled down in Washington again, obviously with his girlfriend. And it was around this time that the two of them had that baby girl. So yeah, now he's a father. But without the army to keep him in check, Israel found himself giving in to his dark desires to hurt people. So a lot of the information, or most of the information that we have about Israel Keyes' adult life and about most of his crimes comes straight from him. This is all the information that he's told the police, that he's told the media. We don't really have any other sources because he lived a very isolated life. It's not like he had like school friends that can talk to the police, or like, you know, there's very few witnesses of him and his crimes. So with that in mind, take pretty much everything with a bit of a pinch of salt, because you know what serial killers can be like. They like a good lie. They like to embellish things. They like to make themselves sound horrific, because that's what they want. So like I said, take everything with a pinch of salt. I've tried to like fact check everything as much as I can, but when it's coming straight from the guy, that's kind of hard. So Israel Keyes said that he always kind of knew that he wanted to kill people. And then when he became an adult, this became even more serious for him. He knew that it was time to start killing people. He knew he wanted to kill a lot of people. And he knew that the only way that he could do that successfully, the only successful way to be a serial killer and to keep killing, is to never get caught. Because, well, the second that happens, you stopped, aren't you? So he knew that the most important thing for him throughout this journey of his was to make sure that he never got caught. And so he came up with a bunch of different rules that he would abide by to make sure that he never got caught. And his biggest rule that was more important to him than anything was to make sure that he didn't have a pattern with the crimes that he committed. Because once you've got a pattern, police can predict what you're going to do next. You know, if you have a certain victim type, then they can presume that you're going to attack someone of that type next. So Israel didn't have a victim type. He also didn't have any particular kinds of locations that he would target. He just didn't have a pattern. Because the fewer things that are the same between cases, the fewer things police have to connect the cases. If two murders are completely different to each other, then they're not going to connect them, are they? And it's for that exact reason that the FBI didn't even know that they had a serial killer on their hands for over 10 years. Nearly 15. It was nearly 15 years that this man was an active serial killer, but because each of his killings were different enough from each other and they were far enough away from each other, none of them were ever connected. Between 2001 and 2009, Israel claims to have murdered multiple. And for these ones, we don't ultimately have that much evidence and stuff. Like I said in the beginning, a lot of the information comes straight from Israel himself. But these ones are believed to be true. He said that his first murder victim was in 2001. He didn't give many details about this one. He just said that he disposed of the body in a lake afterwards. He said that he followed that up about a year later when he murdered a young couple. He beat the man to death and strangled the woman to death. And again, that's all he told the police. He then committed 2 separate murders between 2005 and 2006, after which he ditched both of those bodies in Crescent Lake in Washington. And other than all of that I just told you, absolutely nothing else is known about those 5 murders. We don't know names, we don't know even specific timings. Even Israel himself couldn't remember what year he did what in. It's actually quite scary how casual all of this was for him. Like, I don't know. I imagine committing murder is a big monumental thing for your brain to handle. You would probably remember that day, would you not? Especially for someone like this, someone that wants to kill, finds excitement in committing heinous acts. You would think that would be quite a memorable occasion for him. You would at least remember the year. But then again, maybe he does remember things and maybe he wasn't giving away information on purpose. As you learn more about Israel Keyes, that does seem quite possible. He was one of those guys that liked to have control over the police and liked to have control over the situation. He wasn't a blabbermouth. He will only say exactly what he wants to say when he wants to say it. So maybe that's all on purpose, that he didn't give over much information about these other murders. But he did say that each of these murders that he did between 2001 and 2009 were all in different locations, in different states entirely. Israel would travel to commit his murders. He would get a plane and then a train, and then he would hire a rental car and he would drive out to a different state. Like, he would leave as convoluted of a trail behind him as possible so that it would be hard to track. Whereas if he literally just got like one train to a different city and committed murder there and then got the train back home, that's a lot easier to follow than plane to here and then car to here and then train and then a boat all the way around. Like, you know, he was really sending police through a loop. Not that they even knew to look for him yet, but just in case. Just in case it got to that point, he was throwing them through a loop. So rather than choosing specific victims, Israel Keyes would choose his locations. Just like how he chose the Deschutes River. He didn't plan on, finding that girl on that particular day. He just knew that he was going to wait out by that river until he found someone. And that was the same with all these different locations that he would go to. He would get a plane, then a train, then a car, and then he would wait there until he found someone to kill. He would choose the location over the victim because, like I say, he had absolutely no victim type. He would kill any gender, any race, any age to a degree. Actually, that was the only one rule that he had, was that he wouldn't kill children. But other than that, anyone else was a potential suspect. He would just wait out in his chosen location until anyone walked by and the coast was clear, no one was around. He would claim any victim, anyone that was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And nobody had any idea that he was doing this. He never confided in a friend that he had this weird dark hobby. There was nothing. I mean, this man would go murder someone and then get the train back home to his girlfriend and his daughter. I really wonder how much his girlfriend knew about all of this. I think I read somewhere that she thought that he was just traveling for work, but again, I don't know how much we can trust that. I always wonder that about the unsuspecting partner that had no idea that their husband was actually secretly a serial killer. It's like, really? You really didn't suspect anything, really? I don't know. I mean, that is possible. Some serial killers are just so good at avoiding detection that even crosses over into their own family life. Eventually, in 2007, Israel's relationship with his girlfriend broke down, and so he moved away with his daughter. He took his daughter with him. And I actually think he found another woman pretty quickly, and they moved to Alaska. This man did a lot of moving, and it was so confusing for me during the research. But now he's in Alaska, and this is where he settles, right? In Anchorage, Alaska. So that's where he lives with new girlfriend and with daughter, and he wouldn't kill in Anchorage. He didn't do any kind of crimes in Alaska. He would always travel out and do them elsewhere and then travel home to his safe little family bubble. So now that he's set up in Anchorage, Alaska, he starts up his own construction company that's doing pretty well, and he's keeping up this facade of a normal family man pretty damn well. But underneath all that, his crimes were getting more and more intense year by year. Alongside his serial killings, Israel Keyes was also doing full-scale bank robberies regularly. He was robbing people's homes as well. He was robbing firearms. This man was completely unhinged, literally committing any kind of crime just because he wanted to, just because he could. And he could get away with them as well, which is so frustrating. This man barely ever saw any consequences for his actions. And you would think, right, that if you're a serial killer that is trying to avoid detection, multiple bank robberies would be the last thing on my to-do list. Because, I don't know, it's very rare to get away with a bank robbery, is it not? You wouldn't really want to be drawing any attention towards yourself, would you not? It's crazy. But like I say, he managed to get away with chuffing everything. Pretty much everything he ever did, he could have gotten away with. Had it not been for one mistake that he made at the very end of all of this, that kind of got him caught for everything he'd ever done. What baffles me even more about these bank robberies is that he was doing them all on his own. He didn't even have henchmen or a getaway driver or I don't know, an accomplice, anything. This man was doing solo bank robberies time after time and getting away with them. And getting away with the money as well. Because, of course, he needed this money. Well, I say he needed this money. He didn't. But in order to do what he was doing, all that traveling in order to commit those murders, all of that costs a lot of money. A flight here and then a rental car down here and then you get a boat over this river. That shit adds up. So he was robbing banks to be able to fund his serial killings, to facilitate his need to commit murder. He was also robbing banks. And of course, there were all the supplies that he would need on top of the travel, and trust me, this man went to town on his supplies. He would have multiple weapons, he would have disguises, he would have things to clean up after the crime. And I'm really excited because now I get to tell you about Israel Keyes' murder kits. or they're actually called kill kits, but I don't like that, the way that sounds in my mouth. So I've changed it to murder kits for this video, but he is known as the kill kit killer. But as I say, my mouth don't like that. Kill kit killer. But this was the part of this case that made me really want to cover it, because this is one of the most calculated, terrifying things I've ever heard in a true crime case. And trust me, I've done a lot of them. You've been around for a lot of them. You know, I've heard some shit, and this is crazy. Because to be fair, we've all heard of killers putting together a bit of a murder kit before, you know, where they'll grab a bag and they'll put like some gloves and a mask and a knife and like a bin bag in there to clean up in the aftermath. We've all heard of that. But Israel Keyes takes it to the next level. He was like that, but on steroids. And then put that on steroids as well. So the way that Israel Keyes would go about his multiple murder kits was he would get like a bag or a bucket or something, and he would fill it with weapons. So there'd be at least a knife, a gun, some ammo, rope. He was accounting for many different murder methods. It just depended what he felt like doing that day. On top of that, there would also be like some wads of cash in there for in the aftermath if he needed to pay for anything. There'd be things to help him clean up after himself, like drain cleaner he would use both to clean up any potential crime scene, but also he would use this drain cleaner on his victims' fingerprints and on their face, just in case their body was recovered. They would be like quite hard to identify. He also had bin bags in there, you know, for the cleanup. He had like quite a bit of cleanup stuff. And then he had disguises. So in each murder kit, he would pack a hoodie, some sunglasses, a mask, you know, anything to like cover up his face. He made at least 12 of these murder kits, and then he proceeded to scatter them around the whole United States. Well, obviously not the whole thing, obviously like 12 states, but he scattered them around in these different locations that he had previously scouted out and thought, this could be a good location to commit murder. So he would take a murder kit down there and hide it or bury it, put it somewhere secret, and then he would leave and he would go home with the knowledge that if he ever found himself in that area again and felt like adding to his victim toll, he could, because there would be a handy-dandy murder kit hidden just a few meters away for him to run and get. How insane is that? I've never heard of a killer being so prepared in advance, like that he would make a murder kit and then just leave it there until he was ready, until he found himself in that area again. What? Sometimes these murder kits would lay there in these secret locations for years, completely untouched. No one had any idea that they were there, but he just hadn't had a chance to go back to that state and commit murder yet. So like, it can just wait until he's ready. There was no major rush with him at all. He knew that he was going to be a serial killer for a long time because he felt like he was pretty good at avoiding police detection, and unfortunately he really was. So there was no rush for him. He thought he would get there whenever he felt like it. One of the first instances of Israel Keyes actually using one of his pre-planted murder kits was in 2011. He travelled to Vermont because he'd actually previously hidden one of these murder kits in an area of a bunch of isolated houses. There were just like a lot of land in this area, and there were just a few houses dotted about, and he thought, perfect, there's no neighbours there to hear or see anything or to call emergency services. And so he'd planted one of these murder kits a long time ago, and in 2011, June 2011, he was ready to use it. So he travelled to Vermont and he checked out the location once again, just double checking it since it had been quite a while since he decided this was a suitable location. And there were a few things that Israel would check for before he attacked. Of course, one of the most important things was that the area was isolated and there were no neighbours around. That's taken care of. The next thing that he would double check was that there were no children in the house that he was going to choose, because obviously he had that no children rule. He would look in the yard for like bikes or toys, or he would look in the windows for like drawn pictures or anything like that. Any obvious sign that there was a child in that house, he wouldn't go near it. He didn't want to harm children. In a similar vein, he would also check for signs of a dog. Not because he didn't want to harm a dog, but just in case the dog wanted to harm him, I guess. If the dog started barking the second he tried to break into the house, then it'd alert everyone. So he would check outside the house for any like beware of the dog signs or like dog toys or a dog house, anything. So yeah, in the summer of 2011, he travels to Vermont, double checks all of these houses, and one of them was perfect. It was out of the way of everyone, clearly had no kids, no dog. It fit all of the criteria that we just talked about. And this was the house of an older couple named Bill and Lorraine Correa. Bill and Lorraine were both in their 50s. They never had kids, so they didn't really have all that much family. They just kind of enjoyed living their lives together in that house. For the last 5 years, they'd owned that house in Vermont. On June 8th, 2011, Bill and Lorraine were having very normal days. They both woke up and they both went to work, had a normal day at work, and then got home, had dinner together, spent some time together, chilled out, and then they locked up the house and went to bed. Little did they know, for the last 2 years, they had been living right by a secret stash of weapons left out by a serial killer. And tonight was the night that that murder kit was going to be put to use. Just after midnight, Israel Keyes jumped into action. He started by breaking into the Correa's garage, and he had all of this planned out, by the way. He knew that this was how he was going to start the attack because he wanted to cut the phone lines, and of course they're connected in the garage. He wanted to make sure that the couple would have no way of calling 911, no way of calling for help, no way of alerting anyone that anything was happening in the house. So he went and cut the phone lines first before he even went into the main house. And after this point, Israel wasted absolutely no time. He said it took him only about 6 seconds from when he cut the phone cords to like being in Bill and Lorraine's bedroom. He stormed all the way up there, and they did hear him come in, or he thinks they did, because they seem to have like started to get up and out of bed, but obviously 6 seconds is no time. By the time they'd even realized that there was an intruder in the house, he was already towering over them in their bed. And at this point, Israel already had the ski mask over his face. He had a gun already pointed at them. They already know that this is an incredibly dangerous situation, and they've had no more than a second to kind of get to grips with this. The first thing he did was tie them both up and then tie them to the bed so that they couldn't move. And he was playing this more like a burglary at first. He just tied them both up to keep them there, and then he started ransacking the whole house. He was rushing from floor to floor, looking in all their drawers and everything. He was grabbing anything that seemed valuable to him, and he was also like in their bedroom demanding to know where the valuables were. He was asking where Lorraine kept her jewelry, where they kept their bank cards. And once he felt like he'd grabbed everything of use to him in that house, it was time to carry out the second part of his attack, because barely anyone ever survived an Israel Keyes attack. He rushed back over to Bill and Lorraine, who were still tied up and still tied to the bed, and one by one, he cut their ties from the bed, so they were still like bound at the wrists, but they were free from the bed. And one by one, he marched them downstairs and sat them in their own car. He sat Lorraine in the front and Bill in the back seat. Lorraine in the passenger side seat, of course, because she's tied up, she can't drive. And this whole time, Israel said that the two of them were really pleading for their lives, like really trying to bargain with him, saying that they would give him absolutely anything. They wouldn't tell anyone what happened. They wouldn't report this to the police if he just let them go. But of course, Israel already had his mind made up. He already knew what he was going to do to the two of them. It's so eerie that they didn't know who they were dealing with on this particular night. Like, this was a serial killer, an active serial killer that police didn't even know existed. It's like, of course, bargaining for their lives isn't going to work, but how were they to know that? How were they to know that this man had a kill streak and they were just another one of his victims on that night, and that he'd done this time and time again? It was formulaic. He never felt any remorse, yet they tried. Every single one of his victims tried to plead with him or fight him off, and it very rarely worked. Just after 4 a.m, Israel drove the couple out into the middle of nowhere in their own car, and he stops at this big abandoned farmhouse. And I'm pretty sure, knowing Israel Keyes, that he had researched this farmhouse and he knew that this was the perfect place to commit murder. It was isolated, it had no neighbours, and it had been abandoned for years. So no one was passing through it, no one was checking on it. It was the perfect place to do something so heinous and then be able to just kind of leave the scene behind as well, because no one ever went there to check on it. So he drives the couple into the driveway of this farmhouse, and one by one, he takes them in. He starts with Bill, right? So he grabs him out of the back of the car. He's still tied up at the wrists, and he drags him down into the basement of the farmhouse. He had him at gunpoint this whole time. Meanwhile, Lorraine was left on her own in the car, but we'll get back to her in a second. He takes Bill down into the basement and ties him up down there as well. So as I've been saying, his wrists have been tied this whole time, but now he is tied to something in the basement, so he's like double tied. Meanwhile, as Lorraine was left by herself in the car, she had been trying her absolute best to wriggle free, and it was working. She'd managed to get one of her wrists out of the zip ties, and she'd managed to open the car door and actually get a few feet out and like establish her surroundings. But it was at this moment that Israel emerged from the basement. Lorraine didn't have much choice here. She knew she just had to start running and just pray that she could outrun this man. She had no idea where she was. She had no idea which way could lead her to safety. She just had to run. So she starts running, and Israel notices that she's gotten out of the car and she's running away, and he can see her, right? And he knows just how dangerous this is for him. Like, if she was to get away and tell anyone about this whole thing would be over for him. And so something took over him in that moment, and he started sprinting at Lorraine. And unfortunately, he was faster than her. He reached her, pinned her down, retied her wrists up, and then started dragging her to the farmhouse. When he dragged Lorraine into the farmhouse, he didn't take her down to the basement to be with her husband and to have them both in the same place. Instead, he forced her up the stairs and into one of the bedrooms. He tied her to the bed, and the whole time she was like kicking and screaming and fighting him off her, but he was just too strong for her. He overpowered her, tied her to the bed, and this whole time she could hear her husband screaming for her, shouting her name, trying to find her. Of course, she had no idea where he was, but she could hear him, and Israel could hear him. And this really panicked him, because Israel thought he'd gagged Bill pretty well, but clearly not, since he's shouting for Lorraine. So this kind of freaked him out, because, well, it's apparent that he's wriggling out of his restraints. He'd managed to get out of his gag. Does that mean he'd managed to get out of his zip ties around his wrists? So Israel made sure that Lorraine was like bound to the bed as well as he possibly could, and then he raced down to the basement to go and check on Bill. As he made his way down, he made sure to grab two weapons, a knife and a gun. When he got down to the basement, he saw that Bill had managed to wriggle out of his gag, like I said, but he hadn't managed to get out of his wrist ties. But this was enough to piss Israel off, because he felt like this couple were too smart for him. They kept trying to get away, and they were nearly successful. And he was getting frustrated at this point. He had never had such a tough victim before. Bill had actually also managed to, I think, he'd gotten out of some sort of tie. I'm not entirely sure what the exact ties were, but I know that Israel had tied him in a way that he was on the floor of the basement before, and now when he came back, the gag was off and Bill was standing. He was still kind of bound in place, he couldn't move, but this, like, he clearly managed to get out of quite a lot of the restraints. Israel was so angry with Bill that he just kind of ditched the two weapons that he'd brought with him, and instead he grabbed one of them big shovels off of the floor of the basement, and he starts just beating Bill over the head with it. And Bill wasn't going down, by the way. Bill was putting up a fight against this shovel, and them things are heavy. Yeah, Bill didn't even, like, lose his footing or anything. And this was only making Israel even more angry. He felt like he couldn't overpower this couple the way that he could overpower his previous victims. At this point, he was fuming, and so he just reached for the gun in his pocket, pointed it at Bill Courier, and shot him to death. He shot him multiple times. Like I say, he was so angry that he just wanted to make sure this man was dead. He was done playing all these games and trying to tie them up and torture them and scare them and rob them. He just wanted this man dead at this point. So he shot him so many times, in the face, in the chest, in the back, literally everywhere. And when he was sure that Bill was dead, Israel made his way up the stairs of the farmhouse to where he'd left Lorraine tied to the bed. No doubt she'd just heard her husband get murdered. She'd just heard Israel go down with a shovel and start beating her husband, and he didn't have a gag in, so no doubt she heard all of his screams, everything that he was saying, and then she heard several gunshots, and she hasn't heard anything from her husband since. I can't imagine how horrifying that would be to hear your loved one get murdered and you're tied up. You can't do anything to save them. You just have to sit through it and hear it. That is one of the most horrifying things I could imagine. So she's laid there, tied to the bed. She's just heard all of this, and then her attacker, her abductor, emerges, and he proceeded to rape Lorraine twice as she was still tied to the bed. Again, she's trying her best to fight him off of her, but he is just way too strong, and she's tied in every possible way. She's gagged. She really doesn't have much energy to fight with either. When he was finished raping her, Israel proceeded to cut her ties. He cut her, I think, completely free. If not, there was just one around her wrists. And he started to drag her around the house. He dragged her all the way down to the basement so that she could see her husband's dead body laying on the floor in a pool of his own blood. He actually threw Lorraine down on the floor right next to her husband's dead body, and that was where he killed her, right next to her husband. He strangled her to death. I don't know whether he did it with his hands or with a rope that he brought. No doubt the murder kit that he left in Vermont had a rope in it. And now Israel Keyes had 2 more dead bodies on his hands. Now, his usual MO for getting rid of bodies was to strap weights to them and then throw them in a river or a lake and try and get rid of the bodies in water. But this time he went about it completely differently. I think this was one of the first cases where he poured drain cleaner on his victims' faces and on their hands or over their fingerprints to try to melt them and make them unidentifiable. He then put Bill and Lorraine's bodies in garbage bags and tied them up and just put them in the corner of the basement. Now, his initial plan was that he was going to set fire to the whole farmhouse, so the whole thing would burn down to the ground with Bill and Lorraine in it. Every single piece of evidence would be burned in this big fire. And he was planning to go through with this right up until the very last minute, right up until he bagged up their bodies, put them in the corner of the room, and then he realised it was almost daylight outside. And once it's daylight, people are out and about. They're getting up for work. They're driving on the roads. What if someone saw a big farmhouse on fire? They're going to call 911. They're going to get the fire department down there. They're going to put this big fire out, and then they're going to find 2 dead bodies in the basement. That's literally like snitching on himself, really. If he was to set fire to this house, it's just drawing so much more attention to the crime that he's just committed. So instead, he just left. He just left the bodies in the basement and moved on with his life. Went back home to Alaska to his girlfriend and his daughter. So as I said in the beginning, one of Israel Keyes' biggest rules when it came to serial killing was to distance himself as much as he possibly could from his crimes and to not have a pattern, to not connect himself to his crimes in any way. And for that reason, he would travel all over the US. But for his next murder, he decided to break his own golden rule. And it was the one time he broke this rule that had been working pretty well for him so far, but it was the one time he decided to break this rule that absolutely did him in. It was this one time that he got caught. On February 1st, 2012, Israel popped down to a local coffee shop. It was like a little shack in the middle of like a car park, a little kiosk. It was called Common Grounds Coffee, which, by the way, I think is such a cute name. Israel had been scoping out this coffee kiosk for quite some time, and he felt like it would be quite an ideal location to commit one of his attacks. Which, by the way, I find it quite interesting that he'd been scoping out a coffee kiosk literally in his own hometown. It was in Anchorage, Alaska, which, like, you live there with your girlfriend and your daughter lives there with you. I don't know, for someone with such an important rule, it seemed that he'd been, like, planning to break his own rule for quite some time before he did it. But anyway, like I say, he'd been scoping out this coffee kiosk because he'd noticed quite a few characteristics about this place that made it the perfect place to carry out an Israel Keyes attack. This place was relatively remote, especially in the evenings. No one was really like actively using this car park during the night, and the coffee kiosk was open until about 8 p.m. He'd noticed that the closing shift was usually around 8 p.m. and the person that worked the closing shift was usually a young woman on her own. She was the only employee on the closing shift. So all of this together, he would have a victim that was defenseless and alone, with no one to help, with no one to see that this was going on. The car park would be empty. To Israel Keyes, this was perfect. On this particular day, February 1st, 2012, Israel Keyes headed down to the Common Grounds coffee kiosk just before 8 p.m. because he wanted to make sure that he was the last customer before closing. And since it was February, it was already dark outside. Like, not even just dropping dark, like it was pitch black outside. And just as Israel had predicted, there was just one young woman working the closing shift that night. Her name was Samantha Koenig. She was 18 years old. She was working the closing shift alone, as she had done many times before. She was pretty used to this. So she was cleaning down the machines and, you know, turning things off, getting things ready to like put the shop to sleep. And that was when her final customer of her shift arrived. Israel gave Samantha his order, and I think he also handed her a travel flask, you know how you can take your own cup in. So she takes the cup off him and she turns around into the kiosk to start making the drink. When she finished, she brought the cup back over to Israel, who was now standing, pointing a gun at her through the service window. There's actually CCTV footage of all of this going down. You see the moment that Samantha spots the gun, she sets the cup down and just puts her hands in the air as soon as she can. She doesn't know what's going on here. She doesn't know this man's intentions. Israel ordered Samantha to switch off all the lights inside the coffee kiosk, and so she does. She does as she was told. He then climbed through the service window that she had just, you know, taken his coffee cup through and gone to hand it back through. He climbs in through that window and demands that Samantha gets on her knees, and she does again. She's very compliant through all of this, thinking that she might get out alive and safe if she just does as she's told. He tells her to kneel down on the floor, and so she does, and he takes her wrists and zip ties them together. And now that she's, you know, bound on the floor and she can't really do anything, he starts ransacking the coffee kiosk to a degree. I mean, what is there to ransack? Just the till, really. So he empties out the till, and it's not that much. It's not as much as he's used to. He's used to robbing a whole house, you know, getting bank cards and jewelry and valuables and spare cash lying around. This was just a cash register's worth of coffee money from the day. And so he starts asking Samantha, you know, where's all your stuff? Where's your bag? Where's your card? She didn't really have anything on her at the time. And so she tells Israel that her bank card is in her boyfriend's truck, which is currently parked in his driveway. And she even says to him, look, I can give you the directions to go to his house and to get into his truck, and I'll tell you the PIN card for my bank card. You can like go and take it. Just please don't hurt me. Israel didn't take her up on her offer yet. Instead, the next thing he did was just drag Samantha out of the kiosk and into his truck that had been waiting for them in the parking lot. During the car journey to wherever her abductor was taking her, at some point, either before, during, or after this drive, Samantha, just like Lorraine before her, managed to wriggle out of her ties. She managed to get out of this car and she managed to start running. She got quite a bit of a start on Israel, and then he realised she'd gone. He flew out of the car and unfortunately caught up to her. He overpowered her once again, tied her up once again, and took her back to the truck. So now they were back inside the car, and he's now angry at Samantha for defying him and trying to get away from him. And this is also bringing up all those feelings from the last attack where he felt outsmarted and overpowered by this couple. So now he doesn't like Samantha. And it seems that at this point he was already planting the seeds to cover up her murder, her future murder that he hadn't even done yet. He grabbed her phone and he started texting people off of her phone as if he was her. So he texted, I think, her dad and her boyfriend and maybe one more person. I think it was her boss. And he texted them as her, saying that she was going through a really hard time and she just needed some alone time. She was going to go away for a few days just to clear her head and just to, He ended this text basically saying along the lines of, "Don't look for me, I'm fine. Like, don't worry about me." Which, I mean, if you were to get a text like that from one of your loved ones, from your girlfriend, from your daughter, saying, "Hey, I'm going through a hard time, so I'm going to go away for a few days, don't come looking for me," the first fucking thing I would do is try and track them down and try and speak to them, try and give them a hug in person. That is going to worry anyone. And it did. It worried her boyfriend and her father. Oh, and her boss. Sorry, I forgot there was a third one. I just think that's one of the dumbest things that Israel Keyes has done so far, and I don't want to blow smoke up him or anything, but he's done a relatively good job of being undetected and unsuspected up until this point. So why would you do something like that that's going to clearly draw more attention to the fact that she's missing and that she could potentially be a danger to herself? I mean, if someone just goes missing and they're saying, "I'm not having a good time right now," your brain kind of immediately goes to the worst places, that they could hurt themselves, they could take their own life. So in situations like that, the missing persons search is going to be ramped up. So he just shot himself in the foot, really, hadn't he? But anyway, Israel Keyes now had his very first hometown victim in his car with him. And this was a very different experience. This was very new because he'd never killed anywhere close to home. So he decided that, given the location, he was going to bring Samantha Koenig back to his own house. Back to the house that he shared with his girlfriend and his 10-year-old daughter. She was 10 now. He has been a serial killer her whole life. And he was going to take his next victim back to the house where his daughter was likely just asleep in bed with her cuddly toys. How sick and twisted. So he takes his hostage back home and he parks the car up in the drive and he leaves Samantha tied up in the car as he ran inside the house and double-checked that his girlfriend and his daughter were asleep. And they were. He then went back out to his car and dragged Samantha into a garden shed that was kind of at the top of his drive. It was out the front of his house. And Israel had already prepared this shed because he knew full well that he was going to try and find someone to murder that night. So he had set the scene. He had put a huge plastic tarp over the whole floor so that there would be no blood, no mess. There were 2 heaters in there as well. I presume that wasn't for his victim, but more so for him as he embarked on the process of dismembering the body or whatever he planned to do. Those heaters were in there for him in the aftermath of that. And there was also a radio in there that he later used and turned the volume all the way up to drown out the sounds of Samantha pleading for her life and him killing her. He tied Samantha up in the shed and then he decided to go and try and find this bank card. She said her card was in her boyfriend's truck and he had nothing to lose, really. She was tied up in his shed. She couldn't go anywhere. So he thought he might as well go and look for it. He followed those directions to the boyfriend's truck and he breaks in and he starts rummaging around for this card. Now the thing is, Samantha's boyfriend actually saw this happen. He looked out of the window and he saw some guy breaking into his truck that was parked on the driveway, but for whatever reason, he didn't report it to the police. He didn't report to the police that someone had broken into his vehicle and was robbing it, robbed his girlfriend's card. I don't know if he took anything else. I mean, he probably did. The police weren't alerted anyway, and Israel got the card successfully and went back to the shed where he was keeping her, and he got her to repeat the PIN code and he engraved it on the back of the card so he wouldn't forget it, so that he'd be able to use this card, well, for as long as it's got money on it, I guess. And for the next 3 weeks, no one heard from Samantha Koenig. It was like she went to work one night and then disappeared. She just texted 3 of the closest people to her in her life saying that she wasn't feeling very good at the moment and that she was just going to get away for a while. And that she did. No one saw or heard from her ever again. Her family had reported her missing literally the same night that she hadn't returned home, and so missing persons investigations were well underway. And it was 2012 at the time of this case, so you've got to imagine social media was pretty new and they were really trying to use it to their advantage. They were making Facebook pages, where is Samantha Koenig? Have you seen Samantha Koenig? This was was spreading like wildfire, particularly on Facebook, like her missing persons photo and everything. But annoyingly, like as widespread as this case managed to get so quickly, so many people found out about this within like the first week. But despite that, there were barely any useful leads coming in. It seemed that no one knew anything about what happened to Samantha. No one had seen anything or heard anything. No one suspected anyone in particular. There were no suspects whatsoever. That was until February 24th, 3 weeks after Samantha disappeared. Her boyfriend received a text from Samantha's phone. The text read, "Connor Park sign, under pic of Albert. Ain't she purty?" A very eerie text to have received from Samantha's phone. It clearly wasn't her, and everyone immediately thought this had to be her abductor. So police, along with her boyfriend, race down to Connor Park, where they find this poster for a missing dog named Albert. So they knew they were in the right place. Just underneath this missing dog poster was a note that was like put in a little plastic bag. It was all taped up, and they knew that this was probably what they were looking for. Inside this little bag were a couple of pieces of paper. The first was a ransom note from Samantha's abductor, demanding money in return for her safely. They demanded that $30,000 be transferred into Samantha's bank account so that they could then use her card and use the ransom money. The note then said that if all of this was completed, if they got that money today, then Samantha would be let free within 6 to 12 months. They would contact police and let them know how to find Samantha within 6 to 12 months. Of course, not a good situation at all, because in 6 to 12 months, they could do anything to her. They could harm her, they could kill her, they could traffic her, send her anywhere in the whole entire world in 6 to 12 months. They could do absolutely anything. This is not an ideal ransom situation. Well, no ransom situation is ideal, Jesus. But you know what I mean, like once police are working with a ransom situation, these are terrible conditions, you know? So they were gonna try to work to change the ransom agreement with the assailant. But in the meantime, Samantha's family was so terrified and so desperate to keep their daughter safe and alive that they just sent $5,000 over to her account then and there as soon as they saw this note, because they thought at least if they send a little bit of something, that might be enough to keep her alive in the meantime while they tried to sort out this ransom agreement. This ransom note was typed up, by the way. Obviously, if it was handwritten, then handwriting analysts, I think I just malfunctioned. Handwriting analysts would be able to, I don't know, derive certain things about this person. They obviously knew, well, Israel obviously knew, we know who sent the note. Israel obviously knew to type it up. He said in this note that the $30,000 that he expected to be receiving for Samantha's ransom, he would be using this card all over the United States. He even mentioned in the note that he probably wouldn't be using it in Alaska very much because it's a smaller population. But he said that once he left Alaska, he would be using it all over. And I think this was probably an attempt from Israel to throw police off his scent, to get them looking nationwide, all over America for him, when really he probably would still just stay put in Alaska. He's probably just preemptively trying to throw them off of his scent by sending them on a wild goose chase to places that he doesn't even intend on going to. So I said there were a couple of pieces of paper in this little baggie, taped up baggie. There was this ransom note, and then there was a picture. It was a picture of Samantha. It was a picture of her sitting there holding a newspaper, a very recent newspaper, like one of the most recent issues. And this was sent as like proof of life, proof that she was alive with this man and that he could get her back alive, supposedly. So that is all the information that police have about Samantha Koenig's whereabouts, and that is that she is in danger, she was abducted, someone wants money for her, and they're not willing to let her go for quite some time. This was going to be one hell of an investigation to embark on, but like I said, in the meantime, her family had sent $5,000 to her account just as like a buffer, just to keep her abductor happy for the time being. And as soon as Israel got this money in the account, he started using it. And that was the worst mistake he ever made throughout this whole case. Well, I say mistake. It was a mistake for him, but it was a very happy mistake for us and for the police and for the whole entire population of America, because this mistake is what led to Israel Key's downfall. Of course, using a bank card leaves a trail. Every single time you spend money on it or get cash out, I mean, that's exactly what he was doing. He wasn't spending money on the card each time he went into a store. He would go to ATMs and withdraw huge chunks of money, or as much as he could every day, and he would just live off cash so that he was leaving as little of a trail as possible, but he was still leaving a trail because he was still going to ATMs, and that was logged. Every single ATM that he went to, the location, the time, everything was logged. So police do have some locations, although this isn't a very efficient way of tracking someone's location, because I mean, as soon as you get a hit on one ATM, the assailant is probably going to speed away and get as far away from the scene as they possibly can, because police would be on their way. And by the time police got there, the assailant would probably be gone. So it wasn't going to help them find Samantha's abductor like immediately, but at least it gave them a bit of a pattern. It gave them a way to maybe predict where he was going to go next, you know, because he was going to different ATM machines in different states. That's how much of a gap Israel was trying to put between himself and the police. So from the locations that he'd been to so far, they were trying to pinpoint where he might go next and be one step ahead of him. But another very useful thing that they managed to get out of these ATM visits was the security footage. And I mean, Israel had already accounted for this. He knew that there was going to be cameras. So every time he'd gone to draw cash out, he had a mask on, he had sunglasses on, hood up, like big hoodie on. So they couldn't tell anything about this man. They couldn't see more than an inch of his skin. So they didn't know what he looked like, what kind of hair he had. They didn't even know what kind of build he had, because he had this big chuffing hoodie on. But one thing that they could tell from this security footage was the kind of car he drove. Because Israel, as smart as he was in some aspects, he forgot that his car was behind him in the security footage. He parked a car, got out of it, and the camera sees the whole thing. So now they know that he drives a white Ford Focus. And the same man was seen getting out of the same car every single time Samantha's card was used. It was used in 3 different states at this point. It was in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. So like I said, police are trying to predict where he could go next, and because they now know what car he drives, they were able to send out an internal alert to all of the states where they think he could pop up next, and they say, okay, be on the lookout for a white Ford Focus with a male driver. And that's all they can really say. On March 14th, which was about a month and a half into the search for Samantha, officers in Texas spotted a white Ford Focus leaving a motel. And they remembered this alert that was put out for a white Ford Focus, and they decided to follow it. They knew that they wanted to try to pull this car over. They wanted to see who was driving it. They wanted to speak to the man, but they didn't really have grounds to do any of that. They kind of needed an excuse to be able to pull him over or to speak to him. And so they were really keeping an eye on his speed and his driving to see if there was absolutely anything that they could like get him for, technically. And then all of a sudden, he goes a few miles over the speed limit, and they think, perfect, amazing opportunity. They pull him over and they think, right, okay, now is our time to investigate this man. They walk over to the car, and the guy in the driver's seat is visibly anxious. He's sweating, he's acting a bit shady, a bit aloof, a bit just not right. He wouldn't let them see his driver's license right away, like he wouldn't hand it over. I don't know what he was saying, but excuses as to why he couldn't give them it. And then eventually he does. And when he hands them it, they realise why he'd been so shifty about it before, and that was because it was an Alaskan license. This guy was from Alaska, where Samantha Koenig was abducted from by a man in a white Ford Focus that had recently been using her bank card in Texas. As soon as they saw this Alaskan license, all of these pieces connected together, and they knew they had Samantha Koenig's kidnapper. So the police that pulled him over performed a quick search of his car, and they found so much evidence to support their suspicions. They found the whole disguise that this guy had been wearing every time he went to an ATM, the hoodie, the glasses, the mask. They found just like big wads of cash laying around as well, as if he'd been repeatedly making trips to the ATM and getting the max amount of cash out. And they also found in this man's car Samantha Koenig's bank card with her PIN number engraved into it. With undeniable evidence against him, the police arrested this man on the spot, and you already know they got it right. It was Israel Keyes. He was arrested for the abduction of Samantha Koenig, and that was it. Little did police know they had just captured a serial killer. A serial killer that had gone undetected, yet very active for 15 years now. But like I say, they had no idea about that right now. So they take him to the police station and they start interrogating him just on Samantha Koenig and her whereabouts. But Israel Keyes was not the kind of guy to freely give over information. I mean, at this point, he knew the jig was up. He knew that they had evidence against him and that they were gonna put him down for Samantha Koenig's abduction. But regardless, even though he knew he was fighting a losing battle, he was still going to make the police work for it. He wasn't going to give over any information for free. He wanted something in exchange for what he would give them. So he would give over certain little pieces of information in return for a cigar or a coffee or a Snickers bar. And then finally, after he'd manipulated as much as he possibly could out of the police and he knew he couldn't get any more, he finally confessed to abducting Samantha Koenig. And he told police that she was already dead. And she had been dead since the night he abducted her. But this confused police because, well, they'd seen that photo that was sent alongside the ransom note of Samantha sitting there with a recent newspaper. He had sent proof that she was alive. So how could this be true? How could it be true that he killed her the same night he brought her home? Well, Israel went on to tell them the whole story, that he abducted her from the coffee kiosk, drove her back to his home, took her into his shed where he sexually assaulted her and then strangled her to death. All in one night. Once he had killed her, he shoved Samantha's body into one of the cupboards in this shed and he cleaned up after himself, and then he went back in the family home to go to bed next to his girlfriend. The following morning, the family wake up and they head off on a 2-week family holiday on a cruise. Israel Keyes is able to just board this cruise ship and let his troubles go for 2 weeks after just murdering an 18-year-old girl and stuffing her body inside his shed. And it was while he was away, relaxing, that he got the idea to do this whole ransom thing. But there was a bit of an issue. He had already killed her, and you can't really ask for a ransom for someone who's already dead. He needed her family to think that she was alive and to think that they had a chance of getting her back alive as well. He needed to somehow make Samantha's dead body look alive. Her body wasn't all that decomposed to say that she'd been dead for 2 weeks already at this point, because she'd been practically kept outside. This was Alaska, it was freezing cold, and the shed was quite thin-walled, so her body hadn't decomposed, like, at all. Well, I say at all kind of visibly or majorly visibly. So it wasn't quite as hard as you might think to make this 2-week-old corpse look alive. Israel brushed Samantha's hair, braided it, he put some makeup on her, which I presume was his girlfriend's makeup, which is creepy. And then the last thing he did, which is the most vile of all, I haven't heard anything like this in a true crime case, he proceeded to sew her eyes open with fishing line. He sewed this girl's eyes open and then sat her up, put this newspaper, like propped it up in her hand, and then took a picture of her, printed this picture of her dead body looking alive, and sent it to her parents. Her parents, her loved ones, saw this photo of Samantha dead, and they didn't even know that she was already dead in that photo, they thought that they had a chance of getting her back alive. Like I said, that is one of the most vile things I've ever heard of a killer doing to their victim, especially in their death. To prop them up like a mannequin and take photos of them is absolutely harrowing. Of course, in these photos, you could kind of tell that she was dead if you know it. And so Israel like tried to mess with the photos a little bit. He made it black and white. He made it a bit blurry before he printed it. And it really, in the photo that he sent to police and her parents, the one with the ransom note, you probably couldn't tell that she was dead. I mean, they obviously couldn't tell because they were working to try and get her back, to try and rescue her. That photo gave Samantha's family and friends so much hope in the beginning of this investigation, which just breaks my heart that she'd been dead the whole time. She had been dead from the night that they reported her missing, but for weeks they thought they had a chance of getting her back. This photo that Israel took of Samantha's dead body has never been released by the FBI, of course, and I don't think it should. But there is a recreation that we're about to show on screen, and it is disturbing, so maybe look away for the next 5 seconds, but this is a recreation of that photo that Israel took. And like I said, this one is disturbing enough on its own. I hate to think how disturbing the original would have been. So anyway, now Israel Keyes has confessed to everything to do with the Samantha Koenig abduction and murder. Police know everything they need to know about that one. Little do they know, that is only one of many. Israel started to bargain with the officers, saying that he had lots more stories to tell. But again, he had some conditions. He wanted some things in return for the information that he could give them. One of his conditions was that he wanted his name to be kept out of the press. When all of this hits the news, he didn't want to be identified and named. Not for his own benefit, but he said for the benefit of his daughter. His daughter was a normal little girl. She had no idea who her dad really was and what he was really like. And he said that he didn't want his actions to affect her throughout her life just from association and, you know, being his offspring. Of course, because I'm making this video right now, we know that his name was never kept out of the press. Well, actually, I think they did try to in the beginning, but realistically, if you're a serial killer, the newspapers and journalists and investigators are going to do their absolute best to try and figure out who you are and blast you all over the news. So yeah, his first condition was that he wanted his name out of the press, and his second condition was that he wanted them to guarantee that he would get the death penalty within the next year. He wanted to die because that would be easier for him than handling the consequences of his actions. So when police were presented with these conditions, they said to him, look, okay, we will try to keep your name out of the press as much as we can, as much as we have the power, like, to keep you out, but that's not the be-all and end-all of the news and the media and the press. Someone is going to likely leak your name to them, but the police on their behalf were going to try and do the best that they could. And on the death penalty thing, they basically said to him, like, look, I don't think any judge will ever grant you the death penalty as long as you're dangling information over their heads like this, saying, I have loads more stories to tell, but if you're not going to tell them, no one's going to sentence you to death, because then you take all those stories and all those answers to the grave with you. So really, he'd kind of shot himself in the foot here. He had told them, I'm responsible for a lot more that you don't know about. And then he said, but kill me within the next year. And they've said, absolutely not. If we want to get this information out of you, tell us what you've done, and we're not killing you. So he wasn't going to get what he wanted on either of those counts. He was not going to get any of that. Yeah, he'd really done himself in here. He wasn't going to be able to get the sweet release of death that he so wanted unless he gave up all of the information that he had, because no judge is going to sentence a man to death only for him to take secrets to the grave with him. Absolutely not. So Israel started to give over more details pertaining to Samantha Koenig's murder. Well, more so the aftermath of her murder and how he disposed of her body. He said that once he'd started to get the ransom money, he decided to just get rid of her body. He dismembered her in the shed in his driveway in front of the house where his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were playing. He then loaded Samantha's remains into the back of his truck and drove them out to a lake. Now, as I said earlier, this is Alaska. It's very, very cold there. So the lake wasn't a lake, it was a big block of ice. Well, no, it was a lake underneath the big block of ice. It was a frozen over lake, basically. Why did I make that so confusing? Israel's plan was to pretend that he was ice fishing, you know, where they cut a circle in there and then they go fishing in the frozen lake. But it was the middle of the night when he did this. Who goes ice fishing in the middle of the night? Israel Keyes, clearly. He went out to this lake and he cut a big hole in it and then put Samantha's body in there and just left her in the lake. But actually, he wasn't done there. He then actually did get a fishing line out and did go ice fishing. He caught 2 fish and took them home to his family, and they cooked them and ate them for dinner. Fish that he had caught right next to the dead body that he had just ditched in this lake. The psychology of this man freaks me out more than anything. Like, the way that all of this is so normal to him. He sexually assaults and murders a young woman in a shed outside of his house and then goes on a 2-week family cruise. And then he comes up, dismembers the body, and then goes and catches fish to take home to his family while he's discarding the body. It's crazy. I feel like with almost every single case, I am continually gobsmacked by how insane serial killers are. I don't know when I'm going to get used to it. I will never get used to things like that. Catching fish where you've just ditched a corpse and then taking them home and making your daughter eat it. Anyway, so police now know where Samantha's body was ditched, and so they sent out a team of divers, and this was one hell of an operation because her body had been there for a little bit of time now, and of course the lake was frozen over. It was a huge operation, but eventually they found her remains. Her remains were recovered and her family was able to have a funeral for her. But as all of the diving mission was going on, because like I said, it did take quite a while, police were pressing on with their interrogation of Israel Keyes because he's already admitted that he's got more to tell him, so now they were going to try and pull it out of him. They knew that by now, Israel Keyes had to be responsible for more kidnaps, rapes, and murders. He'd done this one of Samantha Koenig way too confidently and way too well for it to have been his first one. He seemed practiced at this. Eventually, Israel did admit to the police explicitly that he had murdered other people, but he wasn't going to give them much more detail than that. He was trying his best to get what he wanted out of the police, but they weren't giving him it. That's not to say police weren't so frustrated with how stubborn Israel was being. They had to keep going with their tactic though. They couldn't bend. But trying to get information out of Israel was like trying to draw blood from a stone. He was not giving them anything. He thought he was super smart, giving them like little slivers of information that he thought they weren't going to be able to do anything with. So he'd say like, oh yeah, one of the times I committed murder, it was of a couple in Vermont, which he thinks is very vague information. And it is, isn't it? A couple in Vermont, like, that's going to be so hard for police to look into. But what he didn't account for was police piecing together these little slivers of information that he gave them. So he would give them like 2 different slivers from the same case, and they would work it out in their head, along with some, of course, Google searching and searching in the police archives and all of that kind of stuff. They had Googled missing Vermont couple, and it came up with a picture of Bill and Lorraine. Piecing together these tiny little pieces of information that Israel gave to them, they managed to put together a little bit of a timeline, and they believed that Bill and Lorraine Couriers were the people that Israel was talking about. And so they printed this photo of them out and they took it to Israel and they said, look, is this the couple that you killed in Vermont in 2011? And he said yes. He then started to confess more and more about that case as well, just like how he did with the Samantha one. Once you crack him, he'll give you everything. So he told them that he kidnapped the couple and took them out to this farmhouse, gave them directions to go down to the farmhouse. He even told them that he'd left the bodies in the basement. He even told them which particular corner of the basement, right? So police think they're onto a winner. They're going to get there. They're going to recover these remains. They're going to have answers for Bill and Lorraine's family. But they get down to the address of this farmhouse and there is nothing there. There's not even a building there. The farmhouse had been demolished because it had been abandoned for so long, no one had ever bought it, and so eventually the whole thing had been demolished and there was nothing left there. Bill and Lorraine's bodies had likely been transferred to landfill along with all of the house rubble, and so there was very little chance of being able to get them back. I believe landfill investigations and searches were done. Searching landfill is such an impossible task. It's so dangerous. It's so vast. Imagine trying to look for one thing in a big pit of everything. We've covered cases on this channel before where if a body is believed to be in landfill, it's pretty much a write-off, and I hate to say that, but there's been very few bodies actually recovered from landfill because these huge scale searches go on for ages and they're so dangerous, and they very rarely wield any results. So they're very rarely even done. Like it's rare that police will say, okay, let's go out and search this landfill. But because they believe that this was a serial killer, I mean, by admitting to the murder of this couple, he has just admitted to 3 murders. He's a serial killer. So in situations like this, they just go for it anyway. But like I say, they could never find the remains of Bill and Lorraine Currier. But that being said, even though they didn't have the body evidence, they are still confirmed to be Israel Keyes victims. Because there was still so much evidence regardless of the fact that they didn't actually have their bodies. Like the fact that Israel could tell the police the entire layout of the couple's home in Vermont because he'd broken in there. He'd also managed to describe their physical appearance pretty well before he was even shown that photo of them. They let him kind of describe this couple beforehand just to make sure that they had the same couple. And yeah, he remembered what they looked like. Oh, and he even told police, when he told them to go and check out the farmhouse and they'll find the bodies there, he also told them to go and check out a local lake because that was where he ditched the weapons. And so a search was done there, and the weapons were actually recovered. So the weapons were where he said they were. He had to be telling the truth. By this point in the investigation, the news of this serial killer is starting to break in the media. But as per Israel's request, the serial killer is anonymous. No one knows who they are yet. But Israel's starting to get worried because, naturally, everyone had been trying to figure out who this serial killer was, and they were getting closer. And to Israel, this meant that police weren't keeping their side of the bargain. Their promise was to keep him safe and out of the news and anonymous. And Israel felt like they just weren't pulling their weight. And so he decided that he was going to stop cooperating too. If police weren't giving him what he's asked for, he's not giving them what they've asked for. He stopped talking completely. He would just sit in his cell, silent all day. He would not cooperate. He wouldn't say anything to them, never mind answering questions. He wouldn't do anything. Although one day when his cell was searched, they found a makeshift noose in there, which meant that they had to put him on constant supervision. He was put on suicide watch. There was someone that was meant to come in and check on him every 30 minutes. He was even referred to the prison's mental health ward, and he was treated there for a little while. And after that, he was transferred to the standard maximum security prison cells. Now, one important thing to note about these cells is that they don't have any security footage. There's no cameras in these cells. When he was released from the ward, Israel was still on suicide watch. He was checked on individually every 30 minutes. Someone would come into his cell and make sure he was not planning anything. And every 4 hours, as standard, they would do a whole ward head count, where every 4 hours, the prisoners would go and stand outside their cell and get physically counted by the staff. So there was a lot of checking in on him that was to be done. But on the morning of December 2nd, 2012, a fellow inmate, when they were standing outside of their cells for head count, one of these inmates noticed blood coming from Israel's cell. He hadn't shown up for head count, and so guards rushed to his room, and there they found Israel Keyes had been dead for hours. It seems that security guards and officers hadn't been checking on him how they were supposed to have been. It was supposed to be every 30 minutes plus every 4 hours. and he hadn't been checked on for a minimum of 8 hours. It could have been more than that. There was at least 8 hours that he had all by himself where he decided to take his life through a series of different injuries. I don't know absolutely every injury that he inflicted on himself, but the most serious one, the one that ended his life, were 2 major cuts to each of his wrists. And if that wasn't graphic enough, what I'm about to say is very graphic, so if you're queasy, skip forward a little bit. But once he had cut his wrists, Israel then went on to draw in his own blood. He drew 11 different pictures of different skulls, and on the bottom of one of them, again still in his own blood, he scrawled, "We are one." And then he drew another picture that was of like an animal skull in a pentagram. Don't know what was going on there. So police have looked at this evidence that Israel has left behind, and they're thinking, okay, these 11 skulls likely correspond to 11 victims. Is this him finally confessing before he dies that he has killed 11 people? But unfortunately, because Israel Keyes stopped cooperating with the police and decided to take his life as soon as karma came to bite him in the arse, unfortunately, we will likely never know the full truth of this case, which is devastating. I mean, there's things police can probably try to find in the way of physical evidence and stuff like that, but without the perpetrator, we're not gonna get much more. He takes so many answers with him to the grave, and he denies so many families of having closure over where their loved ones are and what happened to their loved ones. If he did have 11 victims, we're not aware of who most of them are. He barely gave over any names or even any descriptive information about these people, so it'd be so hard to try to connect a missing persons case to a potential Israel Keyes victim. Really quite a heartbreaking end to this case. I mean, you hear of killers killing themselves in prison and no one really bats an eyelid, but when it's in a way like this, where they do it as a statement because they don't want to give over their answers, it's such a kick in the teeth way to end a case, and I'm very sorry about that. But thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, as always. If you appreciated this video in return, please leave me a thumbs up down below, or you can comment, because engagement really helps to push these videos, and YouTube doesn't like to push them because they are depressing, I'll admit that. Thanks again to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. Remember, you can click the link down below in the description if you want to get the exclusive deal I talked about earlier. Trust, I love Magellan TV, and I know that you guys will love it too. A huge thank you to all of my channel members for supporting the channel and helping me decide the cases that I cover. All of my tier 2 members are on screen right now, so thank you so much. If you want to become a channel member, you can click the join button down below. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you want to watch another one of my videos, I'll leave you one on screen right now. I'll pick one out specially for you. Or if you want to subscribe to my true crime channel, I post content like this every week. So click my face. Bye. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.